And we started to really start to look at history and where did the term punk rock, or not even punk rock, but even more niche, pop punk first start, because that was where we were going to start. Because I think you mentioned this earlier, is that it's really important to have eras, and it's really important to go through time. So what was important with this was being chronological and not trying to rewrite history. We are taking history and spotlighting it for readers, and hopefully there are some artists and albums in here that you've never heard of and that will become essential in your playlists.
What's up, everybody? It's Keefy from GhostCultMag.com. I am super stoked to be joined today by author, former publicist, journalist, etc., and punk rock expert now, and probably always, Paige Owens. How are you doing?
I am great. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. I'm so pumped. Thank you so much on this holiday week that we're recording this interview, and this will run sometime later. But I was lucky to get this book from you and Ruffian Press and your publicist late in the year. This is your brand new book that you edited, 500 Essential Pop Punk Albums. Squeezed it into our honorable mentions for our books of the year. It's an all-year process of me, almost harder than listening to music is to catch up on books, and this was such a pleasure to get and receive and comb through and really spend a lot of time with it. Actually, like, the extra time that we had to do this enabled me to spend another week with the book that really, I think is going to make the difference today for us. But what an undertaking, first of all. It's such a shift in your, and I think from editorial, but then actually to do a book. It's one of my dreams is to write a book. I have a treatment in progress, but like in my brain, like I would have to like almost eliminate everything else from my life to focus on a book. I don't know how you did this. This is remarkable.
Yeah, it was, it's funny because I didn't actually plan to do a book. I was working with Mike Shea, who I worked with at Alternative Press and have stayed close with him. He came to my wedding a couple years ago, and we've just remained in touch, and we were working on another book together. I was editing a book by this amazing punk rock author, Tim Stiegel, who is another former freelance colleague of mine as well. And that book transformed into something so much bigger than it was. And we were like, we need to get some other things in the pipeline. And Mike said to me, he's like, well, what do you got? And I was like, I wasn't expecting that. So it was kind of unexpected, but I was really grateful. I love working with Mike. I've always wanted to be a published author. Obviously I was published throughout Alternative Press magazine, and I work for Adobe Radio, and I run their editorial now. So I've got my fingerprints all over the digital space. And I had been a part of a larger book that we did at Alternative Press in 2019, but I was one of like 6 or 7 authors. So it was a big, huge group project, which was lovely to be a part of, but very different being a part of a group and then doing your own.
I mean, the responsibilities and the undertaking and the project management and just all the P's and Q's being minded just seems unfathomable to me. It's not a word, unfathomable, but anyway, I just made it one. And not to blow up the spot, you were among your many accolades, you were the youngest editor ever at Alt Press, which is crazy. By the way, like, what an accomplishment, and you did a lot of great work there, which I'm appreciative of. As we are well known sort of as being sort of the metal and punk rock website. Mm-hmm. I always say I was punk adjacent. I always had many friends I was the metalhead kid at the punk shows growing up in New York City. And so this book is like not just across a bunch of generations of punks, but like so valuable. I think it's going to be like a teaching tool in the future. I think it's to cut a swath across time like this is hard, but also really gratifying, I think, when people get to read it. And it's beautifully made. Thank you, Ruffian Books. This thing is gorgeous.
Shout out to our designer, Angelo. He did an amazing job. Myself and Mike and Angelo, our designer, we had a vision, but what Angelo was able to execute and bring to life was far beyond what I think any of us imagined in our heads.
Right on. It's kind of like picking up the rock in Raiders of the Lost Ark off the thing, and I
Yeah.
expect the boulder to come knock us over in a second. But I do love that it's sort of my weird musicologist brain. I love organizing things by times. I also
Yeah.
I have another these interviews are a podcast. I have a separate podcast where we do vinyl and music series and things like that, and we always break it down by time. So I
Yeah.
think eras are important. I love that this is right back to the very beginning of punk rock and all the way through now, which is insane. I love that in the forward you mentioned like there's probably going to be a volume, has to be a volume two of
It
this
has to be because it's,
somehow.
yeah.
And but I do love. I know it's good for alliteration to have Blondie to Blink 182, but things begin and end for me as a New Yorker with the Ramones. And I know it's
Mm.
people will argue who was the first punk band. Was it before Stooges, MC5? But Ramones to me, and it's weird because growing up in New York City, and you've worked in radio a little bit too, even later days. For me in New York City, Ramones were on the radio
Mhm.
because they were New York's
Right.
band. They were on the radio alongside of like the Stones and Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. So to me, I didn't even know what punk was as a 5 and 6 year old kid. I just knew Black Sabbath, Kiss, Ramones, and I didn't
Mhm.
know anything else. And then I talked to other people. It's like, oh yeah, no, they were just punks, and we didn't know. We knew they were separate. So it's fun. I will say, I'm not gonna pick too many nits at you and your choices. Only Leave Home is in here. I would have many other titles, but I'm very biased. How do you pick that sorting hat out? Like what gets put in and what gets left out, and how much was? I can't imagine how many records probably had to get cut to make 500.
Right. I mean, and that was, yeah, I mentioned that in the forward that really this could have been 1,000 records. This could have been 5,000 records because I think that everyone's definition of essential is going to vary. When we were kind of debating back and forth with each other, myself, Mike, and I did even talk to Tim Stiegel as he's working on a definitive 1970s punk rock book right now, and it is so in depth. And we started to really start to look at history and where did the term punk rock, or not even punk rock, but even more niche, pop punk first start, because that was where we were going to start. Because I think you mentioned this earlier, is that it's really important to have eras, and it's really important to go through time. So what was important with this was being chronological and not trying to rewrite history. We are taking history and spotlighting it for readers, and hopefully there are some artists and albums in here that you've never heard of and that will become essential in your playlists. But that was really what it was. We looked at when the Ramones and when Blondie were first starting to refer to themselves as pop punk, or when fellow journalists were starting to utilize that term pop punk to describe what they were doing in their sound. And that was where we decided to start with, was for history's sake, where it really started, where the journalists and the music experts were saying it was.
Right on. I often say this to bands. It's like, only journalists, we need to get granular because we don't have a choice. Our lizard brains, we need it spoon fed. You've worked in publicity. I have a little bit of publicity background, both
Yeah.
corporate and music. And we need everything kind of spoon fed to us like a baby. We can't function if we don't have that FFO in a press release that for fans of, we don't know what to do sometimes. And
Mhm.
so, and I've worked in editorial myself a long time. I love the attention paid to Blondie. As I get older, even though Blondie was one of my first loves, I remember very distinctly seeing the Heart of Glass video as like an 8-year-old on TV at somebody's house and just being like, and I don't even like disco that much, but Blondie cut across so many genres. They were so
Mhm.
talented and so deep as a band. Like to just call them pop punk is almost unfair because they were able
Oh,
to
for sure.
transcend this. They covered ska very early when ska was really two-tone from England and very little in America, and they also were new wave before new wave was called new wave. So it's
Sure.
crazy when you look at just not just their hits, but the scope of their albums. So I love that Parallel Lines is on here. Always weirdly, the Parallel Lines artwork also weirdly reminds me of Alice Cooper's pants and Alice Cooper, like Billion Dollar
Yeah.
Babies, Alice Cooper. Like I'm sure there's an overlap somewhere between there. But Blondie's great. I actually saw Blondie a few years ago before the Plague years, and she was still amazing. And I think they're working on a new album. So it's crazy how
Yeah,
relevant
they
Blonde.
were doing some shows together within the last several years, which is great because I mean Debbie is just an absolute icon. Blondie as a unit are just they are legendary. They are going to, I mean, they already are part of like a massive part of music history, but I can imagine that 50 years from now, they are going to be even more cemented in, what they've left in the music industry. And that was one of the, I've been debated on whether Blondie belongs here. And that's okay. That's one of the things that I'm really, I'm actually happy that people are doing that because music is so subjective and that's completely okay. And it is meant to cross genres and boundaries. And I think that's what makes it so exciting and interesting and fun. And I love to have these conversations with people. But, I've heard, Blondie doesn't belong here. What is Blondie doing here? And I hear that. I think it's a valid thing for, that's up for debate. But one of the things that with this specific album that we have in here, they themselves were referring to themselves as pop punkers. And that was, back in the 1970s. And that was something that just wasn't really being heard of back, not yet. It wasn't mainstream yet. It wasn't something that everyone was talking about. So I thought it was important to make sure that they were included regardless of, opinions. And that's totally okay because there will definitely be albums in here that somebody's like, no, that doesn't belong there. And that's okay. Like, that's the great thing about music. And that's also why I'm like, this could be a second book again. And, there will be things that we missed. There will be things that are released in the next, within the last year of 2024 and in the many coming years that are going to have that stamp of essential that belong in a collection like this. So, it keeps going, which is great.
Right on. I got you back on Blondie for so many reasons. I
Yeah,
mean, she was a
thank you.
sex symbol. She was a feminist icon. And
Yes.
she's still incredible. I'm such a huge fan. One band that isn't notoriously missing from the early years is, I think, Misfits. And I was going to ask you about that. Not everybody's a Misfits fan. Some people have never liked them before they were popular, before the shirts were everywhere. I
Mm-hmm.
distinctly remember in my sort of punk adjacent life as a punk kid, a punk, not a punk rocker, but a dumb punk kid in New York with my punk rock friends, tagging along with them to places like CBGB's and Continental and the Bowery and stuff. And I remember like not everybody liking Misfits, and metalheads seem to like Misfits. We all love Misfits over here because of Metallica covers and things like that. But there's definitely a weird wall where some people agree on them and some people are like, nah, no, like corny, horror, weird,
No,
weirdos.
so it's actually it's funny. This is like a very personal story, but when I was working at Alternative Press, I had the pleasure of working with this videographer, Bobby Makar, and he was massive into Misfits, MyChem, AFI, like he lived off of that like horror inspired type of punk. And we would often get into these debates. He unfortunately passed away in 2020 during the pandemic. But it was one of those things where when I thought about whether to include the Misfits, I had his voice in my head saying, that's not pop punk, Paige. And I just felt like, okay, for my own personal thought process, I won't, but I think there's debate for it. So maybe volume two.
No worries, and again, no beef. I'm definitely the person I went after. I spent some time with the book. I love that there's an index of all the bands and all the records
Yeah.
and what and stuff like that. Just helpful for my nerd brain. I definitely was like one Ramones record, four Neck Deep records. God damn it! But I like Neck Deep. No shade. They're necessary also, and they belong. And those albums all belong. Was it hard for you to separate out as we progress right through the '70s and then into the '80s and mid '90s? That's when really there's a huge boom, right?
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of books written about the label involvement. And as you go through this book and you see sort of the pedigree information, on one hand, there's a tremendous DIY record labels sprouting up and things like that, and some of the best records ever really didn't get that wide a release, and it's a miracle that they became popular or the bands became popular. But also you see again and again the major labels that had been the classic rock and yacht rock, which is funnily having a resurgence with that documentary. Never thought I would see that happen. But these major labels, starting with Sire and Warner, all the way through BMG and all the others, even to today, have a major stake in these records, and not just the pop part, but they co-signed these punk bands. Even if their topics were not mainstream, their music surely was becoming mainstream and certainly took a foothold. And the labels had a help in that. How do you think that? Do you think that's just the major labels doing what they do, hoovering up everything, or do you think it's, sort of like an accident, a happy one?
You know what? I think this is such a relevant conversation, especially because I went and saw the new Bob Dylan film yesterday with my mother and my husband, and it was funny because, not to spoil anything, but there's a scene where very early on in Bob's career, he's on stage, and this gentleman walks over to a label exec who was there for another act, Joan, who didn't want to be signed, and he lies and said, that's my act, that's my artist. And I think that that's something that's just so relevant within our community, and I see it now, except it's in a very different form. It's on TikTok. You see an indie artist starting to get popular on TikTok, they start getting views taken up by a label immediately. I mean, it happens so fast as soon as you're hitting those types of numbers. So I think it is just, one of those things that it's labels following trends, trying to have a little bit of everything in their pocket to make sure that they're able to touch a vast community and various audiences. So that's my opinion on it. But I think that obviously it's a much larger conversation that goes, very, very deep, and it's interesting because even in the 70s, I mean, when punk was so prevalent and when pop punk was starting to emerge in those late years in the 70s, it was still such a misfit community. And I still think that even now, today, it's such a misfit community. I mean, look at like the Grammys. They're not awarding, there's not a category for best pop punk artist. There's not a category for best emo artist. They have metal. They don't have punk, but and even with the metal category, it's broadcast before the red carpet's even over. I mean, I still think that the mainstream, whether that be record labels or charts or Grammys or whatever it is, they're still suppressing that misfit community to the masses and to the mainstream. There's still a level of having to go out of your way to discover emo, metal, sometimes just rock in general. I mean, the rock radio stations and whatnot, they cover the basics, whatever is charting. But yeah, I mean, I feel like we still see that trend of like the labels, they do follow what's popular, but the mainstream media, I mean, they're not really giving it a chance still. To this day, still.
You are preaching to the choir on that one with the Grammys.
We get the Green Days, but like they've already done it. They already did it. So of course we're still talking about Green Day. They were a part of that massive boom in the late 90s, even in the early 2000s when, you were seeing people like Gerard Way on magazine covers, like, what was it, Tiger Beat, which was way more teen focused, but it still was happening. You were seeing Gerard Way and Billy Joe Armstrong next to people like Joe Jonas and Justin Bieber on the same cover. That doesn't exist anymore. Those things don't collide anymore. And honestly, it's a shame because I mean, I was young when that was happening, and I felt very lucky that I was not somebody who wanted to listen to no offense, I wasn't into the Justin Biebers of the world. That wasn't for me. I grew up on metal, punk, pop punk, emo, alternative in general, and I liked that I could go and see a mainstream magazine in the grocery store and like my artists that I was in love with and had crushes on were on the covers.
Right on. I have many stories of at least a few of seeing the pre-famous My Chem in New York City, struggling to play local gigs and struggling to bring anybody, and somebody I knew wanted to go see them, and I was like, oh, they're fun. I wonder what they'll wind up doing. And then seeing them. Yeah, and then a couple of years later, Irving Plaza, and then a couple of years later, Humongous, and then a couple of years later, Gone, and then I saw them like 2 years ago at a festival in front of 50,000 people singing Black Parade, and I was like, who knew? And now headlining stadiums, if only for a little bit.
Sold out tour coming up in 2025. I mean, like,
Yeah, and the same for AFI with the anniversary arena show. I don't know that they could pull off an entire arena tour that wasn't in LA, but like
Mhm.
very significant. And I think it kind of goes to show, you mentioned TikTok earlier, so we are also now,
Yeah.
just to fast forward a little bit,
Mhm.
we are now seeing the rise of sort of this new generation of punk bands that are sitting alongside the greats. And I love seeing that you had a Maggie Lindemann and Meet Me at the Altar, and even other artists that drop albums this year, like the Nova Twins and things like that. Just wild, just like, oh, there's a space for new artists that are punk or punk adjacent still. And, it was gratifying to me to see their inclusion also.
And it's important, the thing is that this, especially more alternative genres, I mean, they weren't always so accepting of diversity or, females and the LGBTQIA plus community and people of color. And I think it's just so important that essential does not mean the biggest artist on Spotify, on TikTok, on the Billboard charts, on magazine covers, selling the most albums. I don't think that that's what essential means. I think essential is a very broad term, and it means that it's impactful to the genre, to the community, and it doesn't need to be pigeonholed into because of popularity.
Well done, well done. I think about this a lot. We talk about this a lot in the rock and metal world, in the mainstream world. Like, what happens? Green Day, we might get like 10 or 20 more years out of them. They're in great spirits, and I thought Saviors was terrific.
It was.
Yeah, really, it's kind of weird. It came out the beginning of the year. I was so
Yeah.
happy to see it still kind of place in our albums of the year. We had quite a few punk releases in our top 75 for the year, and covered a lot of metalcore. I did not have Pierce the Veil becoming an arena co-headliner and eventual worldwide arena headliner
I
in
know.
2024 and 25 on my bingo card. They're another band, I think, that sort of pop punk,
Yep.
metalcore adjacent, right? A lot of metalcore bands are kind of, covering an umbrella with things. But at the same time, I do feel like there's a passing of the torch and a changing of the guard. No effects going on retirement, and probably we're going to see Fat Wreck get sold soon, Fat Records, and Sum 41 retiring eventually soon. And we just had a new Offspring record, but is Offspring going to make 10 more records or 2 more records? I have
Right.
no idea. So I do think that we're in a weird and interesting time. And so this also made me think to ask you about what are your thoughts on you talk so much in these entries about Warped Tour and the
Yeah.
importance of Warped Tour in propelling these genres forward
Mm.
into a more modern sense the last 20 years and 25 years, and now it's coming back in some form. I didn't know if you had any predictions about Warped Tour or any
Oh
wish
boy.
lists. Do you have a wish list? I try to tell people to temper their, after we saw what happened this year with a couple of festivals returning, like, temper your
Yeah.
expectations. It's not going to be like 20 Green Days. It's going to be like a
No,
Green
no, no,
Day.
no.
It's going to
Yeah.
be like one big band and a bunch of smaller and newer bands, because they can't possibly put on a Warped Tour the way it was in, like,
No
97.
way.
It's not
Yeah,
possible.
no. That's a good question. And I feel like I'm gonna have to wing it because I've been so busy that I haven't sat down and thought about this. Well, if you had asked me about a month ago, I would have said I want to see Pierce the Veil there, and it's because they were a staple for me growing up with Warped Tour. I just love them. I love what they're doing. I think Vic Fuentes and the boys are just really taking it into. They're modernizing their sound in such an accessible way, and it's just becoming. It's grown so much further than I ever anticipated from them. I always thought that they were going to be like one of those like underground alternative secrets that it's like, oh, if you read alternative press or rock sound or Kerrang, like of course you know them, but like hearing them on like the college stations, they're everywhere, and I'm just like, this is crazy. So I would have said Pierce the Veil, although I don't think that's going to happen. With Vic, has his first son is due in a couple of months, February, and I think that A Day to Remember will play. I think that that's an obvious one. I mean, like they're from Florida, so I imagine that they'll play the Florida date in November. Not to mention that when Warped Tour announced that they were coming back that weekend of when we were young, their video that they posted all over socials was soundtracked to an A Day to Remember song. And I'm like, well, duh, you wouldn't use it. Um, I think we might see Sleeping with Sirens maybe at the California date. Kellen seems to be typing and commenting on lots of videos. So I would love to see them, which is, that could be really fun. I would love to see Devil Wears Prada go out and possibly, co-headline the Florida date with A Day to Remember. I think that could be really cool, especially because they have that collab together that always just gets everyone so excited. But I'm excited for new artists too. Like I'm very certain, I feel very certain like I can kind of pick up what's going on their socials. So like Melrose Avenue, this new kind of metalcore group from Australia, and they've been growing on TikTok like crazy. I think that they'll be performing at least the California date. I believe we'll see up and comer Noelle Sucks performing probably at the California date as well. I like her a lot. She's very cool. I would love to see Meet Me at the Altar. Oh my God, would I love to see them. And I'm going to throw this one in there too because they just got done touring with Green Day this year. I would love to see the Linda Lindas go up to Warped Tour. I think that would be so cool, especially if we got the Linda Lindas and the Interrupters. I would love to see Amy Interrupter interacting with the Linda Lindas at a Warped Tour setting. I feel like that would just be so iconic.
Right on. I'm all about it. I was lucky enough to we cover Riot Fest every year also.
Yeah.
So I always look to Riot Fest as like, who was there last year?
Yep.
Who wasn't there last year or the last 2 years? And so who might end up at these Warped Tours? By the way, for those that don't know watching this, all the Warped Tour dates are sold out, including VIP, before one band has been announced. That just
Nobody's
shows you
been announced.
the power of nostalgia, the power of the draw. I don't know that we will get again like a return to 50 Warped Tour dates. I don't think
we ever
profitable.
will.
Yeah.
I don't think we ever will. And honestly, I think that's smart for Kevin to not do that. I think it would be too much. And I think we're in a spot right now where we're almost to the point of being oversaturated with festivals. And Warped Tour is despite it being called Warped Tour, it's a traveling festival. So I think it being more of a destination type situation, the way Riot Fest is doing, the way When We Were Young is doing, the way that Sonic Temple does in Columbus, Ohio, like I think that's the way to go. Also, I forgot, I want to shout them out. I know that they're playing, the Cab are playing When We Were Young this coming year, but I would love to see them do Warped Tour. I absolutely adore them, and they're just one of those ones that we haven't seen in so long that I would love to see it. Them and maybe like Let Live. That could be so cool.
I had an inkling that maybe there would be some Let Live comeback, especially, again, we want Jason to take care of his mental health, and I'm super excited about New Fever 333, but I just feel like sooner or later, the call is going to be there for him to come back. I have a segue question about the emo book right here, because I pulled this postcard off my fridge for the upcoming I love this cover so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited. Angelo, again, he knocked it out of the park.
The 500 Essential Emo Albums, and there's got to be an overlap between pop punk and emo. Can not to forecast a little bit for the next book that's not out yet, but you can pre-order at Ruffian Books. Plug. Can we, what's that like? What's that process like? Or bands left out of one to put in the other? Or you just like, nope, some bands belong under both Venn diagrams?
Some belong in both. There was definitely, it's funny because I wasn't working on them at the same time, but I did work on them back to back. So what I can say about the emo is, number one, it's a lot more in depth. With the Essential pop punk, it is more of a fun flip through type of coffee table book. So with the Essential Emo Albums, what's different about this is that it is actually going to have a mini review of every single album in the book, which took a considerable amount of time. So it's a lot more in depth. There definitely were albums between the pop punk and then the emo that, there's overlap. There's overlap as far as like My Chem and Paramore, who kind of fit into that hybrid genre. And I know that's another one that's like, especially in emo, it's like extremely up for debate, especially somebody like My Chem. But at the same time, you cannot deny the influence and impact that the Black Parade had on the emo genre, despite it being so heavily infused with punk rock and just rock in general, which, that's definitely something that is discussed within the emo book as well as, but there is crossover. I tried really hard to not make it so much crossover. It's minimal. It's minimal because I really wanted it to be one or the other. I mean, we had those hybrid years, especially in like the mid to late 2000s, where it was kind of like, well, this is just a little bit of both, but yeah, there's a little, but not too much. I think they both did a good job of being true to their genre.
Right on. I do feel like the emo is a little more like more subculture centric, where
Yeah.
obviously pop punk is such a big rainbow umbrella for
Guys.
everything. I also want to shout you out as we wind this down. I have a couple more for you. You've been amazing. I
Thank you.
love how many underrated, like to me, underrated. What I consider underrated bands are in this book, and listen, we all have our favorites, and we all have these pillars of they became transcended punk to just rock, right? Green Day and No Effects and these huge bands, but also at the same time, two albums by Jawbreaker very close and near and dear to my heart. Mest is in here, super to me underrated. Menzingers, even though they have a huge cult following, I don't think they're hugely popular. They're well known, but maybe they're not as they're not everywhere like they could be. So I love that you paid it. There was attention paid to them, respect paid to them. I really appreciate that. I think for people who maybe only know the cursory top couple of layers of bands,
Mhm.
whatever Spotify recommended to them, or somebody used a TikTok song. Please, somebody use a Jawbreaker song on TikTok. Please, please, please. I want to get these guys paid, and so they could come back and do more reunion tours. But yeah,
Seriously.
that's I feel like it's great that you paid that much homage and respect to them too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was something that was really important to me. Like I said, I think essential is just a very broad term, and it doesn't necessarily need to be the most popular for it to be super impactful and influential and important to the genre as a whole. And can you talk about pop punk without talking about Jawbreaker? I mean, no.
Me, no, you cannot. But to some
Right.
people, I was a little bummed to go. I love the Punk Museum in Las Vegas. I tell
Yes.
everybody to go there. It was like going to Mecca for me. And I thought they did a wonderful job, although the Bay Area punk doesn't have anything about Jawbreaker, and I was like, "Ugh," a little disappointed. But that's fine. I'll give them some time. I know they rotate stuff in and out, and I'm
Yeah.
always still hopeful for a deeper comeback by them. And yeah, everybody knows my. I saw that's another band I saw in their first go round when they for Unfun. I saw that sort of attempt at them, and then they kind of broke up, came back to the West Coast, reformed, and I saw the Dear You reunion tour a couple of years ago, like many times at the homestand here in San Francisco, where I'm based out of now. But yeah, are there any brand new or recent, the last few years bands? I know you mentioned Linda Linda's. Are there any newer bands that you're just personally in love with or big, very high on that you see being, a big deal in the future?
Yeah, one of the bands that I'm absolutely just like thrilled about is Baby Got Back Talk. They released, I believe it was in 2020, and I think what they're doing is so special, and I just think that they're really wonderful people and also very humble. I was speaking to them on Instagram after the book came out, and they were just so appreciative that they were included. They were like, "Oh my God, like we never thought, this little album that we were just putting out because we loved it." It's an important album. It is, and on so many levels. And obviously, I'm excited about things that like Jaden Hossler is doing. He's learning from some of the greatest. I mean, you don't get to hang out with Travis Barker and not learn how to be an absolute pop punk rock star, So, and Maggie Lindemann, like I said, Meet Me at the Altar. No Offense, who is signed with Hopeless Records. It was so unfortunately because he was releasing his like debut full length in March of this year, and the book was finished, and I was so heartbroken not to be able to include Growing Up on the Internet, because that is a phenomenal album front to back. The messaging of that album is just amazing. We were able to include an earlier EP in the book because I was like, well, I mean, like if we're not going to be able to get this full length in here without like spoiling the track listing or whatever, like we have to get something in here because what Noah is doing for the pop punk community is just incredible. I just cannot get enough of what he's doing, and the music is phenomenal. I think that Hopeless have such a great roster right now, and I'm really hopeful that, like, with Warped Tour this year, I mean, like we said earlier, I don't think it's gonna be what it used to be, where we would get, you'd see Bring Me the Horizon on a small stage, and I don't think we'll ever get that back. We can't go back to seeing Fall Out Boy playing at 3 in the afternoon as much as we want it. But I'm really hopeful that we'll get a lot of these kind of more emerging, up and coming artists with Warped Tour. Another one I'm really excited about is Pink Shift. I mean, they are just so cool. Again, not in here because they don't have a full length album out yet, but Senses, they're a new Hopeless signee. They did a cover of Chapel Roan that blew up on TikTok, of course. But I'm really excited for what they're doing. Yeah, it's so crazy from when I finished writing this in January to, we're in December now. We're almost a year from the end of this collection, and the amount of incredible albums that have been released within this genre. It's mind blowing to me. It's really exciting because I do think that there is a very steady heartbeat here in this community. And there's obviously a want and need for what this style of music gives listeners. So yeah, I feel like there's just going to have to be a part two because, I mean, there's no denying that there's a ton of really amazing pop punk albums still being released.
Absolutely. Huge fan of Pink Shift. We did a fun interview with them at Riot Fest where they took our interview spot away. Somebody parked a golf cart there, and we just all jumped on the golf cart and did the interview on the golf cart. They were down for anything. They
Down
were
to
awesome live too, like sensational
They're
live
so
band.
cool. And I love them because, as much as we can say like, all right, they fall into the pop punk genre, they've got so much punk like injected into their veins, and they have such a the messages that they bring into their music. I mean, their new single, I think it's called Our Nation, if I'm not mistaken. The music video, I mean, that was really powerful to watch, especially after I'm not going to get into the politics, but especially after we watched the insanity of the election unfold. I mean, good for them for continuing to stay on their path and continuing to put the messages out into the world that they are trying to convey, because we need people like that. I mean, it's crazy. Honestly, I'm surprised we didn't get an American Idiot Part 2 after the bullshit we saw in 2016. Like, I mean, it's crazy. I would really love to see Green Day a little bit return to form and call out what bullshit's going on. That's what pop punk, that's what punk is all about, and I would love to see that. But I think Pink Shift are doing an amazing job, and the Lindas, they're some of the trailblazers within that political conversation of in the pop punk genre, I think.
Right on. We're always going to need it. And the bullshit yet to come, unfortunately.
Exactly. I'm like, Green Day, get in there.
I will give you my one band pitch for your next book, which is Grumpster from Oakland. Put out a great album this year on Pure Noise Record. I think it's self-titled, and they are phenomenal. Right in the heart between pop punk and emo, and they're so good. And I'm just rooting for them to do bigger and bigger things as they deserve. Great band, Grumpster. So, anywho, Paige, wonderful to meet you. Wonderful to hear from you and talk about this book and your upcoming next book, which we'll link everything in the description where people can find you, follow you, buy the books, all that. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today. Honorable mention of the Ghost Cult Top 10 Books of the Year for 2024, only because I got it late, not because of any other reason. It's absolutely worthy and amazing, and I love this thing, and I really am grateful that you got to spend this time with us and share your story.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure to finally meet you, get to sit and chat. I mean, I could have sat and done this for another 2 hours. If everyone would let me, I could continue to go on.
We'll put a pin in it for now and say
yes.
until another time.
Yes, until next time, for sure.
All right, thanks so much for hanging with us, and we'll see you soon. Peace.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.